Present here in Albania for the first time ever the Global Peace Index developed by the Institute of Economic and Peace from Sydney. And now I leave the floor for the address to first to Father Daniele Bertoldi, President of the Foundation Our Lady of Good Counsel.
Thank you, Professor Caruso. I would like to welcome His Excellency Ilir Meta, the Albanian President, Mr. Stephen Killelea, founder and the main sponsor of the Global Peace Index, a very important organization which tries to measure what is happening about peace in this world, if we are increasing or we are decreasing in peace matters. I would like to welcome Mr. Brian William, UN resident, coordinator in Albania, and I just know my paisano from Canada, from Toronto. And I would like to give thanks to each one of you, particularly to the Rector of the University of Tirana, and all the people, the students. There are few students because, you know, there is something in university which sometimes is not according to the peace, which are the exams. And the students are focused on exams and because they try their best. I guess that this event is a very important moment for our university and the CESPIC. Because we are in Albania, we serve in this country, we are focused on these people, especially young people, but we must keep our heart, our mind open to the world. And we must bring into Albania what belongs to the world, but it is not yet well known as the Global Peace Index. It is the first time, I guess, that this report is presented in this country. Regarding this Global Peace Index 2017, I am well pleased to know that there was a very light improvement. They say 0.24%. In the last 10 years, there was a declining of more than 2%, which means that the last 10 years, we started to like much more war than peace. That is wrong. But let us look positively and let us give thanks to all the people of goodwill who are working for peace. I remind myself, and each one of you, what my father used to tell me about his business. He used to have a food store. He told me, Daniele, it is very easy to lose customers. It is very difficult to find new customers. It is very difficult to increase peace. It is very easy to decrease into the peace. And for this, we have to keep our mind, our heart always open to this effort, which belongs to all the religions, which belongs to all the humanity. Another thing that I noticed looking at the analysis of the Global Peace Index 2017 is that the cost for war is $5.40 per person in the world, which means that $1,971, which belong to me, to my efforts, goes toward war and guns and so on. You know that in the world, with $1,971, we can give food to many people. There are people who are earning 1 year less than this figure. And we have to work on that. Anyway, why give you thanks to you because you are present? I hope that this meeting will help us to be more positive and to be better workers about peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Bertoldi. Now I invite Professor Bruno Giardina, Rector Magnificus of this university, for his address.
Well, good morning, everybody. Let me thank first very much Professor Raul Caruso for the beautiful work done in organizing this meeting and for the stimulating title given for this conference. Of course, a very special thank to the President of the Republic of Albania, Dr. Ilir Meta, who, with his presence, outlines the importance of the topic of the day. For all of us, it is a great honor to have him and his important contribution. Many thanks to all the civil and religious authorities, to the Apostolic Nuncio, John Brown, to the ambassadors of Italy, Poland, and Slovenia. And warmest thank to the speakers, Dr. Killelea and Dr. Williams, who made possible to organize this event. The title per se tells us that it's very important things. Tell us that a new era is coming, and the place in which we are outlines the importance of the mission of the university for peace and development, especially in this time of crisis in the global international society. We, as university, have a fundamental social and political role. Our main goal is to improve all over the world the quality of life, outlining that this can be reached only if we are able to promote a true dialogue, a true respect for cultural diversity. In other words, a true respect of human values. Now, since my area of scientific interest is biochemistry and molecular biology, let me do a maybe strange analogy. In human biology, it is obvious that if we feel good, this strongly implies that the different organs, the different parts of our body, of our organism, work together in harmony and in a perfect equilibrium. In other words, this means that the various and different regions of our body are in peace with each other. Hence, they are not in conflict. However, it is much more than this. They are in peace in a synergistic way. Of course, this is due to a fantastic metabolic equilibrium. If we wish to maintain our health, we have to understand which kind of mechanisms are involved in the maintenance of our metabolic equilibrium. This is, in my opinion, the frontier of the modern medicine. Due to Dr. Killelea, a new scientific area is born, the peace area, which has to analyze how it is possible to reach a real peace, through what type of mechanism it is possible to maintain the equilibrium state, and what type of mechanism is involved in the maintenance of a good equilibrium in a continuous environmental change. We are sure that peace is much more than the absence of war. The absence of war may be considered a sort of prerequisite, is a necessary condition, but per se is not enough. I think that this morning, due to the scientific value of our guest, will be a great scientific and human experience. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Professor Giardina. I take only 1 minute and a half. First of all, as Director of CESPIC, let me thank personally Mr. Killelea for coming here. Of course, His Excellency President Ilir Meta, Brian Williams from UN, all the excellencies present here. Thank you very much for coming. 1 minute to say, who is Steve Killelea? Steve Killelea is a successful entrepreneur in IT in Australia, perhaps the most successful entrepreneur in IT in Australia. But at a certain point in time, he had chosen to leave his footprint in the history of humankind, and he already did. So he created this institute, which is called the Institute for Economics and Peace, to produce a measure of peace. In this perspective, I think it's necessary to point out how much worth is this mission. If you think about peace, you would confess that we are more prone to think about war. In the public discourse, in our mindset, we think about war. Professor Giardina states, peace is not the absence of war. This is a philosophy of CESPIC too. This is a philosophy behind the Global Peace Index. This is the philosophy of the Catholic idea of how building up peace, okay? But if you, in spite of the books and the culture, the science, we have been born and raised in a world dominated in the public discourse by war. So the great advancement today, the great achievement that we point out today is that Steve is contributing to change our mindset. Because now in the public discourse, in the media, we listen about peace, not only war. And this is an extremely significant advancement, okay? So perhaps, even if we already knew what is doing in promoting peace, perhaps in the next 50 or 100 years, we will be more aware, or our sons will be more aware about that, okay? So it's not a surprise that he has been nominated twice for the Nobel Peace Prize. So I'm really honored he accepted our invitation here, because it's the first time he came to Albania, to Balkans. And so I'm not going to take your time anymore, but I leave the floor to Steve Killelea for his presentation.
So, right, okay, great. Okay, thank you for the kind introduction, Raul, Mr. President. And before starting, I just want to pick up on the words of the professor, because as he was looking at biology, he was moving in to understanding the way a system works. And I think one of the profound breakthroughs we're starting to see with our work is that we start to view societies more as a system. We can get a better understanding of the way they operate. So I was excited to hear his introduction, but I'll get to a little bit more of that as I move into my presentation. So thank you all for attending. So what I'll do is I'll just start off with a little bit of background on the Institute for Economics and Peace. We have two major products, the Global Peace Index, which I'll be talking about today, and the Global Terrorism Index. These two products alone in the last 12 months have had about 3.5 billion media impressions globally and have been covered in the media in over 100 different countries. We're situated around the world, headquartered in Sydney, Australia. We have offices in New York, Mexico City, The Hague and Brussels. And we have an extensive digital program as well. And just even the Twitter impressions which we've had in the last 6 months account to about 180 million. In fact, we had a Facebook post yesterday, which was the largest Facebook post visited, and that one post had over 1 million people view it. So in terms of communicating, social media is a powerful way to communicate. The work's used by many international organisations, including the World Bank, OECD, Commonwealth Secretariat and the United Nations. And the work is also included in thousands of university courses around the world. And we've been ranked twice now as the 15th most impactful think tank in the world based on size. For a think tank which is fairly new, that's excellent. So now, that's the end of the commercial. I'll now move in to the proper presentation. So we now just look at if we look at the Global Peace Index, it's now in its 12th year. That gives us the ability to be able to do good long-term trend analysis. We rank 163 countries according to their relative levels of peacefulness. That covers about 99.7% of the world's population. We do it according to the relative state of peace, because peace is only a relationship with something else which we either consider more peaceful or less peaceful. There's no country which is truly at peace, nor if you went to the most violent countries in the world, you'd still be able to find some pockets of peace. So peace is a relative state. We use 23 indicators, which we harmonise on a scale of 1 to 5. And it's developed by the Institute for Economics and Peace and overseen and guided by an expert panel of international experts who are experts in statistics, peace and economics. So now, if we start to look at the construction of the index, it's got 3 different major domains. The first one's measuring ongoing and international conflict. The second is measures of social safety and security. There are 10 measures for that, and that forms the largest part of the index because most people relate to their internal security more strongly than what's happening in the world around them. And finally, 7 measures of militarisation. Now, what I'm going to cover today is the results and findings, the trends in peace, the economic cost of violence to the global economy, which I think you'll find truly staggering, which has already been slightly mentioned, and a concept called positive peace. That is the attitudes, institutions and structures which create and sustain peaceful societies. This in many ways is a paradigm shift, and we're building more on the words of the professor. So if we go back, and can draw analogies to health. So if we go back to the 50s, great breakthroughs in pathology. Most people in this room will not die young of a heart attack. We're even curing cancer. So the study of pathology is important. But studying people who are healthy, and you want to remain healthy, you need to study healthy people. You need to learn right diet, correct mental disposition, and regular exercise. You're not going to learn any of that through studying someone on their deathbed. Similarly, peace is the same. If you want to understand how to be peaceful, understand the healthy, not the sick. So, this is a quick mud map of the world. Green is very, very good. Red is very, very bad. The big red patch at the top, that's Russia, and obviously just because of the way these maps are done, it takes up more space than you expect. You'll note that Europe is the most peaceful region in the world, and you'll also see that there's also a lot of blue, or green and light green, up through Asia as well. Africa, you'll see, and Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Middle East and North Africa, the two areas with the most countries in red. So, if we look back over the last 12 months, the level of global peacefulness decreased by 2.7%. Now, that doesn't really mean much to anyone, and I'm going to actually explain it in a little bit more detail as we move on. But what's important, this is the fourth year where we've had a gradual deterioration in peace. So we've got a continuing trend going on here, and I'll talk more about the detail as we move on. But a better way of understanding the change of peace in the last 12 months is look at the countries which have changed. 21 countries become more peaceful, while 92 countries deteriorated. Now, what gets lost regularly in the media is what has actually improved. We only focus on the negatives. And I will come further on in the presentations to some of the improvements over the last decade. If we look at the biggest deteriorations in the last 12 months, we came through a measure of political terror scale. That measures extrajudicial killings, torture, imprisonments without trial. But the interesting thing over the last decade, that indicator has improved. And the other deterioration was the intensity of internal conflict. Now, it's measured on a country average, but what's interesting is we measure that, more countries, the conflict and the intensity's increased. But if we look at the big ones, Syria, Iraq, and Libya, all of them have had actual substantial improvements in their peace in the last 12 months in terms of their scores, which means that may be an indication that these conflicts have actually bottomed. And if we look on the other side, the improvements with military expenditure, which probably runs against what's in most people's minds, and this is a 10-year continuing trend. 88 countries decreased their level of military expenditure as a percentage of GDP, while 44 increased. So if we look at Albania, I think you're about 1.5% of GDP is what is spent on the military, and that's probably stayed fairly constant over the last decade, having gone up and then gone down a bit, if my memory serves me correctly. And the other area where there were improvements is the impact of terrorism. In fact, terrorism globally peaked in 2014, has been improving since, and now with the destruction of the Islamic State and the much weakened Boko Haram, we'd expect these numbers to continue to drop over the next few years. Syria remains the least peaceful nation in the world and has for the last couple of years. Qatar and the Democratic Republic of Congo had the largest deteriorations. Qatar because of the embargoes put on it by its neighbours, and the Democratic Republic of Congo because of the political instability and the ongoing conflict with many militias. It's estimated there are 28 different militia groups just in northeast Kivu in the Congo alone. South America had the largest regional deterioration on the back of increases in violent crime and homicide. Iceland, yet again, is the most peaceful nation in the world and has been for the last 10 years. The Gambia and Liberia were the two countries with the largest improvement. In fact, 4 of the 5 largest improvements last year were in sub-Saharan Africa. The other of the 5 largest improvements was Iraq. South Asia had the largest regional improvement, although it was relatively small. And that was on the back of increases in Nepal, Sri Lanka and Bhutan, not Pakistan and Afghanistan. And Europe remains the most peaceful region in the world, but it did deteriorate on all 3 of the domains which I mentioned earlier on. So, this is a quick look at the 10 most peaceful countries in the world. If you include Iceland as being part of Europe, what you'd have is 6 of the 10 most peaceful countries in the world are all in Europe. Good news for Europe. Another 3 are in East Asia, New Zealand, Japan and Singapore. Singapore is the first time it's come into the top 10. It's the first time an authoritarian or semi-authoritarian country has actually been in the top 10. All the rest are well-developed Western-style democracies, which is telling on the effects which democracy have on creating peace. If we go to the bottom of the index, all bar one country is actually locked in major conflicts internally inside their country. That one country which is not is Russia. However, when we look at it, as I mentioned earlier on, Iraq's levels of peacefulness have improved. Syria's have also, and so has Libya. But what it means is even though they've improved, it's not enough to get them up out of that bottom 10. That bottom 10 is very, very sticky once you get there. So these are the countries which have improved the most, the 5 countries which have improved the most in the last year, along with the 5 which decreased. The Gambia, Liberia, Iraq, Burundi and Senegal are the ones which improved the most. As I said, 4 of the 5 were in Africa. However, other deteriorations in sub-Saharan Africa meant that the region itself did not improve in peace, even though 4 of the 5 ones which were the biggest improvements were there. The big drops were Qatar, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Togo, Spain and Myanmar. Spain fell on the back of the trouble in the Catalonia region, and then the government's robust response to that. That's the first time a Western nation, a European nation, has been in the top 5 countries which have fallen in peace. If we look at this here, it gives an idea of the change in the regions over the last year. The top bar is Europe. You'll see it has decremented, but there were 3 other regions which deteriorated more. North America, and that was on the back of falls for the United States. Asia Pacific and South America. You'll note only 3 of the 9 regions in the world improved in the last 12 months. Now, if we look at Europe in the last 12 months, 23 of the 36 countries which we include in Europe actually deteriorated in peace. I just want to drive that home because I think it's important. As we come around later on and look at slides on positive peace, it tends to be a predictor of what's going to happen for peace within a country. And the good news is Albania has done very, very well on its improvements in positive peace in the last decade, but I'll come to that later. Just as a side note, if we look at the Scandinavian countries, the 5 Scandinavian countries, only one of them is in the top 10 of the most peaceful countries in the world, which is probably a little bit different than what's in most people's heads. And just as a small side note, 3 of the 5 Scandinavian countries amongst the largest arms exporters in the world when measured as a percentage of their GDP. In fact, if you looked at 8 of the 11 largest arms exporters, they're Western democracies. So, what are the trends in peace now over the last decade? So the average level of global peacefulness has deteriorated by 2.38%. And again, percentages are very hard for people to hold in their mind and put into any context. So I'll come back and I'll explain that in more detail just in a little bit later. So 8 of the 10 last years have been declines, and 4 of the 4 last years have been declines. But when we dig into it, you'll see a much more richer fabric than what's actually in your minds. Over half the countries in Europe over the last decade decreased in peace. And no Nordic country now is more peaceful than what it was a decade ago. 62% of countries actually increased the impact of terrorism, and that's really substantial, because you'd find there's something like another 25% of countries which didn't change. So very, very few countries have got less terrorism now than what they had a decade ago. Nearly 1% of the global population is now displaced. So it's about 1 for every 110 people in the world. So about 68 million people. And just to put that in perspective, if we take all these people and put them into a country, it'd be the size of the United Kingdom, or about half the size of Russia, just to give you an idea of how truly substantial this number is. Or if we were to take this room here, at least one person would be displaced. So militarisation has improved in the majority of countries over the last decade, which is contrary to what's in most people's minds. But much of sub-Saharan Africa and large parts of Asia and South America have improved the relationships between states. And even though when we look inside South America, it's very violent, and we look in Africa, there's a lot of internal conflict. They're not between states, they tend to be contained in states. And that has a lot to do with this drop in expenditure. Europe is actually increasing expenditure on militarisation, which is contrary to what's happening in most of the rest of the world. But if we look at this, military expenditure as a percentage of GDP fell in 102 countries. The number of armed services personnel fell in 115 countries. I think there's 119 on the slide, but that's incorrect. It's 115. So there really are large changes. Now, if we look over the last decade, peace is going to be more balanced than what you think. 75 countries actually improved in peace. 85 countries decreased in peace, which came to a 2.38% decrease in peace. So when we look at these 75 countries, there's good news stories in there. And in fact, if we went back for the last decade and we took the countries which have been in conflict for the last decade, or the last 5 years and more, out of the measures, and the impact which they've had, which has flown into, let's say, refugee flows and terrorism into Europe and other countries, would find the world would have actually become more peaceful. And this comes back to the need to be able to solve the conflicts which we're all engaged in. If we can solve them, then we can actually create a more peaceful world. So what were the big deteriorations over the last decade? The number of battlefield deaths increased by a staggering 264%. The number of deaths from terrorism are up 203%. And as we've already mentioned, there are now 68 million people which are displaced around the world. But we also should focus on the positives, and there are a number of positives. So 3 of the big positives of the last 12 months, 26% more countries decreased on the political terror scale. So that's extrajudicial killings, torture, imprisonment without trials. So in many ways, the world has actually become more civil. Similarly, we find that 58% of countries, as already been mentioned, reduced their military expenditure as a percentage of GDP. And we find that a staggering 70% of countries actually have lower homicide rates now than what they had a decade ago. So as we can see, there are improvements. Now, peace is very, very sticky. When you're at the top, it's very, very sticky. When you're at the bottom also, it's very, very sticky. But what we're finding is there's this growing gap between the most peaceful and least peaceful. So the most peaceful countries have actually become slightly more peaceful in the last decade, while the least peaceful countries have become highly less peaceful, in fact dropping on average by about 13%. And this is what we call a growing inequality in global peace. The peaceful nations are becoming more peaceful and the least peaceful are becoming more violent. So let's have a quick look at Albania over the last decade. It's improved 18 places on the Global Peace Index to now be ranked 52nd. So that's a remarkable improvement. That's a big improvement. Because of the and this is all because of the improvements in all three domains which we measure. So Albania's improved on all three: ongoing conflict, militarisation, safety and security. The biggest deterioration was on the impact in terrorism. I'm afraid I haven't got the details across the top of my mind, so I apologise for that, but that was the biggest deterioration. And positive peace, which I'll be coming to in a few minutes, it's improved over the decade by over 10%. And it's now ranked 53. So 52 on the Global Peace Index, 53 on the Positive Peace Index is about the same. But 10% improvement in the positive peace is a lot, because it's a measure which improves slowly over time. And with those kind of trends, if they kept up for another decade, not only would Albania become a lot more peaceful, it should, in theory, become a lot more wealthy, which I'll come to. Improvements in sound business environment, relationships with neighbour, with ones where the biggest improvement, or there's been a small downturn in the relationships with neighbours in the last year. So now I'll move on to the economics of peace, or the costs of violence, depending which lens you wish to look through it. So, if we look over the last year, the cost of violence to the global economy was almost $15 trillion. That's 12.4% of global GDP, and these measures are conservative. We can only count what we can count. The true cost is probably about 50% higher. And, as was pointed out earlier in remarks, that's almost $2,000 per person on the planet. Now, no one can imagine a world which is absolutely peaceful. I can't. I guess you can't either. But it's within our imagination to imagine a world which is 10% more peaceful. And that would be about $1.5 or $1.5 trillion. Now I want you to hold that figure in your mind, because we are going to come back to it. So if we look at it, the average cost of violence to the 10 countries most impacted by violence was about 45% of their GDP last year. And so I said that's conservative. In the last 70 years, and this is a profound stat, in the last 70 years, if we go back, the countries which are high in peace had 3 times the level of GDP growth than countries which are low in peace. And that highlights the economic cost, long-term economic cost, the losses of peacefulness. In the global economy, we just took those least peaceful countries, those 10 least peaceful countries, and they could be as peaceful as the most peaceful. That would add an extra $14 trillion to the global economy, another staggering amount. Now, we'll come back to our 10%, the $1.5 trillion lost through violence. Now, the 10%'s within our imagination, but 1%, we can all imagine 1%. So what is the value of 1%? That's the same size as all global official development assistance, or all ODAs, in 2017. So a 1% reduction, if you looked at it, you could take that and double, if directed correctly, could double the amount of overseas development aid globally, and think of the difference that might make for peace. Now, if that's 1%, how much would 10% be worth? That, my friends, is another way of looking at it. So, 10% reduction is the equivalent of all foreign direct investment globally last year. That's whether it comes out of the US, whether it comes out of China, India, or Europe. So, all foreign direct investment. But to put it another way, if we put it in terms of countries, that's the equivalent of 3 new economies, the size of Denmark, Switzerland, and Belgium. So these figures, which are trapped through violence, are truly, truly staggering. Now, I'm going to move through a series of slides, and just a couple at this point here before I move into positive peace, just to drive home the relationship between peace and economic development. So if we look at the countries which are very high in positive peace over the last 60 years, you can see here that as you step up in peace, your GDP growth rates increase. So the countries which are very high in positive peace compared to the countries which are low, over the last 60 years have averaged 1.8% higher GDP growth every year. And that's a staggering figure. If we look at inflation, so the red chart is low peace countries, the blue bar or blue line is very high peace countries. Inflation rates are 3 times higher in low peace countries compared to high peace countries. So that, again, over long periods of time, has profound effects on the economy. If we look at interest rates are over half in high peace countries as what they are in low peace countries. And again, setting the macroeconomic factors for success. Now I'm going to move into positive peace. This will be the last part of the presentation. So we've got the Global Peace Index. It covers 163 countries and covers 99.7% of the population of the world. So that's enough to form a good statistical base from which one can then do analysis. So we use a whole lot of statistical analysis to now find out what factors are most closely associated with highly peaceful societies. And we've used about 10,000 different data sets, indexes and attitudinal surveys to actually arrive at these figures. Once we arrive at what these things are, we then turn it around into another index called the Positive Peace Index. Because now you've got the ability now to look at countries and understand what their movements is towards or away from peace over time. And that gives us a lot of ability to now be able to do a future prediction, analysis and risk understandings. So in many ways, what we find with positive peace, it equates, and it's also statistically related to a whole lot of other things we think are important. And I've sort of covered higher per capita income through improvements in the economic environment, but they're also more resilient. So when they get hit with shocks, they're less likely to fall into conflict. They're more likely to be able to absorb them. They're also, when hit with shocks, quite often adapt and end up stronger out the back end with new processes and regulations which are put in place. In fact, countries which are high in positive peace have less civil resistance movements. They last for a shorter amount of time, more moderate in their aims, more likely to meet their aims, and are far, far, far less violent. We also find it's associated with better ecological or environmental outcomes. And better performance on development. So what do these positive peace factors look like? They're clumped into 8 different domains, and none of them are counterintuitive, but they all function together. So things like well-functioning government, sound business environment, equitable distribution of resources, free flow of information, good relationships with neighbours, high levels of human capital, acceptance of the rights of others, and low levels of corruption. But they all come together and operate as a system. You can't pull one out and say, this is the cause or the silver bullet which will create peace. You need to be functioning on all of them together. Because, let's face it, does corruption affect business? Does government affect business? Does business affect government? Or does government affect corruption? And what is then is the relationship of the media and a free flow of information through all that? You can't pull them apart. You have to focus on the overall system. And that is a very, very big subject, which I'm not going to get into now, but profoundly different way of looking at how you go about actually developing countries and running them. So now, if we look at the trends in positive peace, what we'll find is globally they've been improving since 2005. However, since 2013, they've plateaued and in the last year have fallen. So too early to say whether it's a global trend or it's just a blip in a long-term trend. The regions that experienced the most deteriorations were the Middle East and North Africa because of the conflict, and it drives home just the effects on conflict, and what you could call a vicious cycle which downgrades the prospects for future peace. And followed by South America, which is on the back of a rampant corruption. Acceptance of the rights of others, which you can see in Europe, is the one which has deteriorated across every region in the world since 2013. So what you're seeing in Europe is happening globally. And what we've also found, for peace to improve, you need a large number of positive peace indicators to improve, where if the resilience, as I mentioned earlier on, is low, you only need a deterioration in a few indicators, and then you have large increases in violence. So if we look at positive peace over the last decade, this is the trend. As the line goes down, that is good. As the line goes up, that is bad. And so you can see that improvement over the decade, except for the last 3 years, where it's basically plateaued. So whether it's the start of a new trend or not, we don't know. But 2 years from now we will, and this acts as an excellent forecast of what future levels of peace will be like. So the research we've got finds that positive peace is an excellent predictor of change in the years from 2007 to 14. So it falls in positive preceded, falls in GPI scores, so Global Peace Index scores. Improvements in positive peace preceded improvements in the Global Peace Index score. And falls in positive peace also preceded falls in 5 major macroeconomic indicators, which I'll run through in a minute. Improvements in positive peace also preceded improvements in these same 5 macroeconomic indicators as well. So as you can see, economic prosperity and peace are highly interlocked. And this conversation is focusing on those economic factors, but there's a whole range of other things like social development metrics which improve with positive peace as well. So countries that improved in positive peace since 1996 had 2% higher GDP growth rates than countries that deteriorated in positive peace. Similarly, countries that improved in positive peace, exchange rates increased by 2% per annum compared to countries which with falling in positive peace where their exchange rates deteriorated. So for attracting foreign direct investment, that's an extra 2% return you get on your investment other than the underlying value of the investment if you're foreign investment. Positive peace also is related to credit ratings, so by international agencies. So countries which fall in positive peace fell 4.5 points. And for every 1% improvement in positive peace, it's associated with 2.9% increase in real GDP growth rates since 2005. Now, just 2 more slides and then I'm done. So if we look at the changes in positive peace globally from 2005 to 2013, we'll note that only one of these pillars deteriorated, and that was the levels of corruption globally. However, from 2013 to 2015, we can see that 5 of these pillars deteriorated, with the largest fall being in the acceptance of the rights of others. Now, if we look at the trend in Europe, again, we can see from 2005 to 2013, 3 of the pillars deteriorated, whereas if we look from 2013 to 2016, we've got 4 which have deteriorated, with the largest being in the acceptance of the rights of others. Now, if you can measure and analyse peace, you can understand the factors which create peace. If you can measure and analyse peace, you now understand the lost economic value from not having peace. That, my friends, is actionable. Gives the better prediction, gives better cost-benefit analysis, gives better program outcomes. And that, my friends, is the end of the presentation. Thank you. If you want more information, they've got it up on the last slide there. So look, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Steve. I think that we all realize how much comprehensive is the work Steve and this staff do on peace. Now I invite Mr. Brian Williams from United Nations. United Nations is the organization who the nation states created to promote peace around the world. So thank you for being here. So.
Good morning, everybody. Your Excellency, President Meta, Father Bertoldi, colleagues, excellencies, friends, thank you very much for inviting me here today to talk about peace. If you haven't realized it already from the last presentation, let me just underscore how lucky you are to have Mr. Killelea here in Albania today. Prior to coming to Albania myself, I spent 6 years in New York managing the United Nations Peacebuilding Fund, and I can assure you that his work has really driven a lot of the thought around peace and how to build peace around the world. So really, the evidence, his contribution and influence is enormous, and you're very lucky to have him here today. In a way, this is a good entry point for me, because one of the title of the presentation or the panel today is What Can We Learn? And one of the things that I think we can learn is that the application of his work is much broader than just that set of countries that we tend to think about and worry about in terms of lack of peace. I mean, there's nothing in his presentation that limited his analysis to those countries that are suffering war at the moment. But because it is a peace product, I'm worried that politicians and policymakers around the world that are not in Syria might think, oh, I don't need to worry about it. But in particular, the positive peace that Mr. Killelea was speaking about at the end is a fantastic concept, and it's a concept that really we should be thinking about applying to every country in the world. Which leads me to one of my favorite topics. I hope all of you know what this symbol of colors refers to. It refers to the Sustainable Development Goals. This is a set of goals that every nation on the planet has agreed to try to achieve by the year 2030. And there is one goal, goal number 16, which is about promoting just and peaceful and inclusive societies. And when you look at some of the targets that are inside this goal number 16, they line up almost word for word with many of the concepts of the pillars of peace, of positive peace, that Mr. Killelea's work has led to. He listed them on his slide, but at the risk of repetition, let me just repeat them. A well-functioning government, equitable distribution of resources, the free flow of information, good relations with neighbors, this is like international law, the acceptance of the rights of others, an investment in social and human capital, low levels of corruption, and a sound business environment. These are all areas of work that, as we know here in Albania, we're talking about every single day. This does not mean that Albania is on the edge of falling into war. Rather, what it means is that these concepts that take a look at some of our most difficult settings in the world, countries at war, have much to tell us about how we can cooperate productively as humans and as institutions. Here in Albania, rule of law is perhaps the obvious place to start. It's been at the center of discussion, at least since I've been here 2 years ago. Albanians themselves overwhelmingly desire improved justice. The EU integration process is calling for it. And in fact, the government, with its judicial reform efforts, its vetting processes, next month in New York, will be presenting it as a positive case study of their own efforts, the judicial reform, at the United Nations, where they will be reporting on progress against the Sustainable Development Goals. But beyond justice and corruption and organized crime, which are discussed so much, there are many other aspects of improved governance, a well-functioning government in his words, that deserve attention here in Albania. The Global Peace Index report argues very succinctly, I think, and I encourage everybody to read the full chapter on positive peace. It's really very good, because it emphasizes the need for government institutions to earn the trust of its citizens. Conflict and competition do occur in every society, and it would be foolish to pretend or even aspire otherwise. Institutions, rather, are needed in order to manage conflict in ways that citizens judge as fair. And in fact, every interaction between the state and the citizen somehow creates its mark. I'm a parent of 2 small children, and somebody told me once that as a parent, you can never say something neutral to your own child. And somehow, peace building and governance is a bit like this. Every interaction between a citizen and the state, whether it is about a national education exam, a visit to the hospital, or going to see your local government, every interaction somehow influences that citizen's level of trust one way or the other. And I think one of the lessons of the Global Peace Index report is it reminds us of this dynamic process. Peace is not something that you take a snapshot of and you say either we have it or we don't have it. Peace is something that evolves through time. Citizens grow throughout their lives, and governments need to be working and changing alongside them. In Albania, and this is the slide, I have just 2 slides I want to show you. In Albania, the United Nations Development Program has been working with IDM, the Institute for Democracy and Mediation, to do some sociological surveys on perceptions of trust in government. And this is maybe a little bit hard to read. The bars are time. So we've done this survey 5 years in a row. So the yellow bar is 5 years ago, and the blue bar is at the right. And you know, you can all look at this. It's a report that's public online. What I take away from this is that we have a little bit of real evidence that trust in government in Albania is improving through time. If you look at the trend line in central government, it's basically going up. If you look at local government, we don't have so much time there. Well, I shouldn't talk about the presidency today. Parliament, the trend line is up. Judiciary, also the trend line is a little bit up. You can look through these and draw some of your own conclusions. But across the board, I would say that, as Mr. Killelea has said, the line is positive. And I think this is real evidence, okay? This is not political pundits spinning things one way or the other. This is the perception of citizens, okay? I think, by the way, in parentheses, this is good evidence for those discussing in Brussels later this week about whether or not negotiations should open, and I'm certainly very firmly on the side that they should. I just want to draw attention to 1 or 2 more here because we're at the Catholic University. So you'll note that in the middle there it talks about religious institutions, and religious institutions are also very much trusted and growing along with civil society here in Albania. I need to wrap up here quickly, so let me just say a few words about the United Nations. I think everything we do here, so whether it is UNDP's explicit work in governance, supporting local governments, for example, but even if it's UNICEF's work on making child protection better and juvenile justice better, or whether it's UN Women's work to try and get women more involved in political life, really everything that we're doing is about building the capacity of institutions, of Albania's institutions, to do a better job of earning the trust of its own citizens. And I want to just close with 2 things, if I may, 2 initiatives that here in Albania I think deserve particular attention around this trust-building work. The first is the authority for the opening of the Sigurimi files. I think the years of communist rule here in Albania have done tremendous damage to the ability of Albanians to trust their institutions. And in thinking about how to regain that trust, one of the important steps they can take is to shed light on a dark history, to expose, to discuss, to get at the truth of what happened here. A United Nations Special Rapporteur on enforced disappearances has noted that of the approximately 6,000 people who are estimated to be disappeared in the communist era, there has never been a single court case against anybody responsible for that, and it's the state somehow. So the Sigurimi Authority, I think, is one effort that can begin to shed some light on this issue and really help the government, the state, earn the trust of its citizens. And the second initiative that I wanted to mention, and this will be my last remark, is around the Regional Youth Cooperation Office. So one of the 8 pillars of peace that was mentioned is the acceptance of the rights of others. This is about how different groups accept and trust one another. And I think the Regional Youth Cooperation Office is really quite a remarkable initiative. It takes 6 governments in the region, and I'm not even allowed to say 6 governments of 6 countries. I can't say that because there is conflict, but I can say that those 6 governments got together, they sit on a governing board together, they've put money together, and they are collectively designing ways for the youth from these 6 contracting parties, as I'm required to say around RICO, how these 6 areas are trying to get their youth to build trust one another, to learn about one another. I think really it is a quite remarkable initiative, and it deserves everybody's support. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Williams. Now, I'm proud, honored to invite Your Excellency, President Ilir Meta, for this speech.
I nderuar Zoti Killelea, të nderuar drejtues të
Dear directors and heads of University, Lady of Good Counsel, Nuncio, ambassadors, professors, students, and guests, it is a pleasure to be part of this activity, especially with the presence of this very important personality, and his own presence will improve the Peace Index and will bring positivity because he is a global known figure, and his presentation of his study on Global Peace Index motivates us to work more on a positive peace. Strengthening especially to preserve peace in the world was the only way for a sustainable peace, for a better world, especially after the Second World War. United Nations emerged as a mechanism to preserve peace and security in the world with its principles. And of course, all the efforts, common efforts of the nations in this aspect to create more trust among each other in the efforts to guarantee not only peace but basic rights, human rights, and to guarantee equality among countries and mutual respect besides their strength and size. It is true that the world today is more peaceful than 70 years ago, despite the relative indicators of improvements and deterioration. And after the 90s, there are more democratic societies and countries with democracy, while at the same time the risks and challenges we have are many, and sometimes they are unknown or different from they used to be. So peace is fragile and threatened, and we must never take it for granted, but we must always work to guarantee peace. Europe and the world experiences a lot of changes, demographical one, political, social and economical, and some of these changes are difficult to be stopped because the efforts to stop them might create conflicts. While at the same time it is our duty, our obligation, which is not easy, to adapt these changes to the main basic human rights and principles. Mother Teresa said, what you can do to promote world peace, she said, go home and love your family. And I think that this is a very wise statement, that everybody shall give its own contribution in the family, community, country, and region. And of course, the family, the school, and the youngsters are the foundation of a society and the perspective of the future. So investing to the children and the youngsters is a safe investment for the future and the peace, because they are the group age that are mostly delicate and mostly exposed to vices in the society. Lack of trust in the future, partial education might cause trauma, social clashes, social problems, and as a result bring less peace and stability. That is why it is our main duty to make development policies towards their skills and in order for them to invest in the future. Because one of the indicators that was shown in the study was that on the investments in the education. Another element to strengthen peace is the war against corruption and organized crime. The presence of corruption and organized crime in the country means not only a threat to the safety, but also an increase in the cost for internal safety and security by removing the possibility to invest in different fields like infrastructure, education, where we must invest continuously in order to guarantee sustainable economical development, and later on sustainable development of the country and strengthen peace consequently. As the study shows, a peaceful country, a country in peace, has continuous economical development and with an increase in the GDP and also in the income per capita. So the sustainable economical development is not enough, but it must be comprehensive most of all, because the well-being is the best guarantee for the peace, whereas poverty is one of the enemies for the peace and basics for the conflicts, and economical inequalities are a risk, a great risk and threat for the peace in any country and in any region. Thus, peace and economical growth and sustainability, as it was said until now, go to the same direction. Religious beliefs contribute to the peace by having an impact, especially in the development, social, moral, economical development. These are very important stakeholders for the development of the society, but especially for the peace in a society. Religious conflicts, as they are called now in the world, as we know in some conflicts that are not far from our region, are not conflicts of religions, but conflicts that disuse religions in order to reach some political or economical goals that they might have. There is no religion that predicates conflict or violence, but each of these religions has in the main goal to create peace, and religious institutions serve in situations of conflicts, and also they make aware their communities for the effects of tensions and conflicts. Albania is a very good model of peace and co-living and harmony among these institutions, religious institutions. So we are proud that this harmony is preserved away from the tendencies that might create any conflict in our country in this aspect. Europe and the world today is living the and the increase of populist trends, nationalist trends that influence the European peace and solidarity after the Second World War. But they also support with nostalgia the revival of some concepts that are a resource for global conflicts. Thus, in front of this situation, government, civil society, intellectuals, important figures of the history, artists, must be together, must come together and speak in the language of peace and act all together in a common vision. This is a challenge and an appeal to understand that the price we pay to preserve peace is smaller than the effects of the conflict and war. We shall not speak. It is not enough only to speak about peace, but we shall act about it. Peace, it's not. It is not a gift that has immunity. It is earned by blood, effort, sacrifices, and it is also very difficult to preserve it. So once again, I want to express the pleasure to be here in this panel and in this presentation, and I hope that we have a cooperation, a better cooperation as a special region, especially here in the Balkans, with Mr. Killelea and also his own institutions. I really hope this will be a very good year, not only for Albania, but for the whole region. There is a positive moment, which is the agreement between Macedonia and Greece regarding the name, which is going to have a very great impact for the region. We hope that the final stage of the dialogue between Serbia and Kosovo to have very positive results also for the region, in order to increase the trust and to make peace more sustainable, and at the same time to be more positive than now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for your speech. Now it's time to go. Before we go, I want to thank everybody who contributed, all the people who contributed to make this event possible. So all the staff here, Yorida, Elsa, the IT staff, Cristo, Claudio, and Costa, Daniela from the press office, and see you next time at the next CESPIC event. Have a nice time.